you're looking at this screen.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be standing right here. So it might look a little different, and some of the tools will have changed, updated a little bit with 2017, but the functionality is pretty much the same. So you want to know how to start from scratch? We'll talk about that. We'll get into a little project here. I want to talk about some of the basics. First of all, my name is Alan, if you guys don't know me. I teach here at the college, video production, and I teach here in the communication or visual communications course. I'm the website administrator for the college. As far as Illustrator goes, I first used Illustrator in 1996, back before Creative Suite and Creative Cloud existed. So I have a bit of experience using Illustrator. It's probably one of my favorite Adobe apps, but it has a very specific purpose in my mind. And so we'll talk a little bit about like its purpose to create graphics. You know, what do you use Photoshop for? Photos. What do you use Illustrator for?
Pictures.
Picture illustrations. Graphics are kind of things like icons, logos, this kind of stuff. I like comic books. So this is sort of a ode to comic book theme. I'm not really going to do much with comic books here. But I want to show you guys a few things. Start with some of the basics of what Illustrator does. So Illustrator works with paths. And here's a fairly, what might look like a basic example, but it's a little complex. In Illustrator, you have, let me pull this out so it's more obvious. We have this thing called layers. And what layers basically do is every element in Illustrator is an element that stacks. So you've got all these different elements that make up the Apple logo. And if I mouse over it, you can kind of see some of the elements get highlighted. And in my layers palette, I can drop this layer down and I can start playing and turning off some of these individual elements. You can kind of see this Apple logo is basically made up of 4 different elements. We've got a gradient that creates the apple, we've got a gradient that creates the leaf, and then we've got 2 paths, which are creating the outlines. And I have no idea what these 2 things are. They don't seem to, there's something. They're invisible. So, you know, creating my outline, and this is simple path. You guys are probably familiar, most of you who have worked with Illustrator at all are probably familiar with what a path looks like, right? So paths are just lines that create shapes. You can fill them, you can give them a stroke. And then you can, and in this case, this is using something called a mesh, which is a gradient, sort of, you asked a little bit about gradients. Gradient mesh is a complex version of a gradient. If you're thinking about just a straight line gradient, that's a little bit different. It's a totally different tool even. But the gradient mesh allows you to sort of create gradients in organic shapes. So this organic gradient gives it more of a 3-dimensional effect. And that's all that is. That 3-dimensional just comes from a gradient that's bright over here and it fades to dark into the corners here. So, what I want to do is I want to start from scratch. No, that's already created. So I'm going to create a new document. So how do you start in Illustrator? This is probably the biggest change from Illustrator 2015. 2017 really has changed up their new document, but its functionality is the same. You just have things in different places and call different things. So I have to know what I want to create to start with, whether I'm doing a print document, a web document, something for a mobile device, or if it's like a screen for a film. Or just some art and illustration. They've got a variety of different sizes, and you kind of have to explore these a little bit to see what's what. And
So for like icons, you would use art and illustration, or?
you know, all these really define is Artboard Sizes.
Oh, okay.
That's really all that this is talking about. So an artboard size for an iPhone 6 is 750 by 1334 pixels. you know, the artboard is very flexible. You can always resize it with your artboard tool. So these are basically sort of starting points, suggestions for if you know you're going to have a poster that's going to be 11 by 17, you would choose tabloid, and then you would create, so it would give you this 11 by 17 poster. You know, you can always use the artboard tool to resize that if that's not the actual size you're going to use. But really, when you're creating a new document, this is just about what size it's going to be. And it's usually measured either in pixels or in points, which is your printing measurement. You guys familiar with points and picas? Anybody heard that term before? Points and picas? Do you know how they relate to an inch? Like what? How many points in an inch? How many points in a pica?
I don't remember that.
12 points?
We used it for yearbook
Yeah.
in high school.
It's a printing thing, so anything that's going to be printed is probably going to be measured in points. Points are 12 points, so it's 12 points in a pica, 6 picas in an inch, so that means 72 points in an inch. So that kind of gives you an idea. 792 by 1224. Anyway, so all these measurements are sort of for the specific output type. If I'm going to print it, if I'm going to go to the web with it, it's going to be measured in pixels because that's screen resolution. Mobile's the same way. Film and video is the same way. Art and illustration, now we're back to measuring in points because it's actually physical size of a print, usually. So that's how I start by, and you can always customize it over here. You can say I want something, it's a specific width in a certain measurement. You know, if you're in Europe, you might use millimeters to measure your width and height. You can tell it orientation left and right. We've talked about, well, we've had you guys do artboards. You can create multiple artboards. So you can tell if you want to do 4 artboards for, like, say you were working on the typography project, you create 4 artboards here, make them all the same size. That's one way to do it. The cool thing about Illustrator that I like is there's always like 2 or 3 ways to do something. So my way might be different than a way that you figured out how to do, and so I may be hopefully showing you some things that you've done one way, and then maybe I'll do it a different way, and you can sort of see which way works better for you. So I have a document, and what I want to do is I've got the Adobe logo here. I want to recreate this logo, and there's a couple here again. There's a couple ways we can do this. I'm going to get rid of this document. Let's go with that one. So I can trace this. There's 2 sort of basic ways I would create something like this. And if I'm going to create this from scratch, we're going to try that. So I'm going to create a second artboard. So I'm just going to basically work in one and reference the other. I'm going to start just by using basic shapes. So I'm going to create a box. It's going to be a square, and that's sort of a cool thing. Illustrator will tell me when I've got a square. It gives me that, I don't know if you can see that. There's a little purple line that shows up when I have a square. That diagonal that shows up tells me there's a square document. I know the Adobe logo is not quite square. Maybe we'll do this. So I've got roughly the right shape and size. Now there's 2 ways I can go about this. I'm going to do the harder way, because the easier way is just to take your pen tool and start drawing shapes. So you click a corner, you click a corner, click a corner, click a corner, and then I have essentially what amounts to 3 independent shapes, right? Does that make sense? I'm just clicking corners and I'm creating shapes. That's one way to do it, and that's fairly easy. But maybe I want this to be a little more as a unit, because these are all just separate shapes. You know, if I move one around, it breaks up the logo. I can group them, but maybe there's another way to do this. So I've got my box, and we're going to maybe, by the way, you guys understand the difference between these two selection tools? My selection tool is going to select whole elements. So this whole box, it selects all of it. If I get my next one over, the direct selection tool, that allows me to select just parts of a box. So now I've selected just one anchor, and I can move that anchor around. Whereas with the regular selection tool, if I select the box, I can't select just the anchor, I have to select the whole thing. So I can select all or pieces of my element depending on which tool I'm using.
When you trace those, like to make the shapes,
Mhm.
how did you move them all together?
How did I move them all together at once? As opposed to what I just did. I actually, if you hold down Shift on the keyboard, and so I have one selected. If I try to select another one, it'll deselect the first one, right? If I hold down Shift, it will add to the selection. So I can shift click multiple items,
Oh, okay.
and then now they're grouped as a selection. They're not grouped because as soon as I let go of them, now I'm back to selecting just one. But I can select all three and then move them as a group.
Oh.
I can also then, if I want to permanently group them, it's not allowing me, I don't know why. There, I can group two of them. So now, this one's still separate. If I select one, that's weird.
You're in direct select.
Ah, that would be why. It makes a difference which tool I have also. If I'm in this tool, these are grouped. Yeah, see, I select one, they're all selected. They are grouped. I can ungroup them and select them individually, or I can shift click, select them all, group them, and now with my selection tool I move them all as a unit. Yeah, and I had the wrong tool. So if I have my direct select tool, it selects individual elements of a group, and then alternatively also individual pieces of that element of that group. Now here's another instance where I see people kind of get confused. I have a group of objects and I'll see people double click on them and then they get this. This is basically I double clicked into this group, and so now I'm working. You can kind of see up here in the top corner, you guys see that? That tells me I'm working within a group. Everything else on this page is now locked because I'm in a subgroup of items. So I can't edit this. I can't edit my box, and you can see it's grayed out. So that's telling me now I'm just working specifically in this group. And to get back, to get back out of that, you just click this arrow, and then everything is back. I can work. But it's kind of useful if you have a group of things and you have stuff overlaid on top of each other. So if this were sitting on top of some other things, I didn't want to accidentally click on this one and move it, but I can double click into my group. Now this I can't click on and move any of that stuff. I can just work within the group. So that's kind of a useful thing to have, especially if you have a lot of elements clustered together and some of them are grouped or some of them are part of a layer. Okay. Also, really just quick of note, I actually can create multiple layers in Illustrator. So right now I've got layer 1, which all it has on it is this background, this Adobe logo that I've been planning to recreate. And then my other layer has these three items, these three as a group, and you can kind of see as I drop these arrows down, here are the individual pieces, and then there they are as a group, and then over here, that's this rectangle on the other side. So the layers allow me, and I see people a lot of time, with things stacked on top of each other. Let's make this a different color so we can see them apart. So maybe this doesn't need to be in the front. You can right click and say arrange, send to back, but that's a little questionable. Maybe if I have too many layers, that becomes an issue. So you can always rearrange things within your layers palette just to drag and drop. So I can move it back to the front. This is a bad example because it really works better if I have like 6 or 7 layers and I'm trying to put it between two things. If I'm just going to the front or to the back, it doesn't really illustrate it as well. But this allows you to drag things and reorder them within the layer. I can do this here, but they're not overlapping, so it really doesn't show any different. Alright, so let's talk about my other method. I'm just going to drag these off. My other method. So I have this, and maybe I want to have this shape, because this doesn't allow me to fill that A with anything. Maybe I want to fill that A with something, and so what I want to do is I can just come back over here and create a shape on my negative space using this pen tool again. And this is trickier because now I can't see what I'm doing. So I may have to go to my swatches palette and select my fill color and just set that to none temporarily so I can see what I'm doing. So I just kind of do the opposite of what I just did to create those three individual shapes. Come in here and I create a shape now in the shape of that middle, and I'll fill it with red just to kind of see, or maybe yellow so you can see better. So now I have that shape. Now I can drag that shape over on my other object, and I have one, I can do this. I can make the fill white, then it kind of looks like it's a logo, or looks like the logo with some transparency, but as soon as I put something behind it, create a box behind it, make it red, send it back, I can obviously tell that, no, that's not really transparent, it's just white. So maybe I want to cut that out from my basic black box shape. Alright, so how do I do that? Any ideas?
Other arrow.
The other arrow?
Yeah, on the right, and then you just like click that area and delete it.
Ooh, that's tempting. I would actually, here's the way Illustrator recommends. It's a good, it's an interesting idea. I won't say it's wrong, but I may suggest an alternative. I was wondering if anyone would suggest the Pathfinder tool. How many of you guys have worked with the Pathfinder tool? A few. Pathfinder tool is super, super powerful. It allows you to join elements, to split elements, to make elements erase parts of other elements. So what I essentially want this to do is knock out this shape from the black shape. So the white shape, and I think it's minus front, right? Does that make sense, right? This is in front of this. So my black shape is behind my white shape. I want to subtract the front. And just to make sure, I'm going to make my white shape slightly bigger because I don't want any accidental black lines to show up between the tops and bottoms of these. So I'm going to try that. So all I do is I select both and make sure that the shape that I want to remove is in front, and I click minus front. So now I have this shape. It's a compound shape, which means it's multiple layers or multiple elements. And if I go to my layers palette, it's here. It looks just about like my other one, basically the same thing, but I've created it in a completely different way. Does that make sense? So there are a bunch of other things you can do with the Pathfinder tool. You can merge shapes or unite shapes. So I can take three shapes that are overlapping and make them all into one shape. Here's a good example of something like that. So I'm going to create a cross out of two shapes, right? So now I have a cross, but maybe I want to make this a little bit different. I want to change where these intersect. So I want to make this corner maybe come out here a little bit, make it so it's not quite a straight line. So I can't really do that. I can do that with this in a way. I can take the pen tool, I can add an anchor and go back to my other tool. I can do this, I can add another anchor to this. It's kind of a pain, but I can do it. So I can create something that does this, and it's taken me a number of steps. I could alternatively, I can come back here, create my shape, and I want to make this corner and I want to do all 4 of these corners, so this is sort of fatter in the middle. So what I can do is I can select both these shapes, and I can use my Pathfinder tool to merge or unite. I don't know why I always call it merge. There's merge down there. There is one called merge, and there's one called unite, and I think they do something very similar. We're going to unite these. So then what we have is a compound shape that I can just go in with my direct selection tool and start grabbing these corners, because it's joined these 2 shapes. And by the way, this little thing here, you guys see this little tiny circle? You probably see it on yours whenever you have a box or something that you have selected. That little circle allows you to round those corners. So you grab that and you start dragging it. It makes a rounded corner in that. So I can select this corner, I can drag it, I can make a rounded corner. So that's kind of a cool little newer feature that didn't exist. I don't think that existed in 2015 even. But now I have a completely different sort of shaped cross here. Using the Unite tool to put 2 shapes together, and then this little fun thing to, I think I can undo it back to, not really. I can make it more. Can't exactly undo it very well though. There. Question?
Okay, so why was it bad to click on the other arrow tool and delete it, like I said first?
Oh, because it's a much more complicated process to do it that way. Let me see if I can go back to that real quick. So I'm creating my box. I've got my pen tool. I'm going to do my, and I'm just going to really quickly do this. So I have the 2 shapes, and just so you can see the difference, there's one yellow, one black. So your suggestion was, I don't even know if it's possible to do it that way. Huh?
The direct selection.
Yeah.
And then click on the yellow, double click on it, and it selects it, and then just maybe that's when you bring in an image from outside.
Maybe.
Instead of making one, because I did it on there was a white background behind an image that I brought in, and I just I had traced it.
Oh.
Expanded it.
Okay. Yeah. That is different.
Okay.
I'll show you what that is real quick. That's kind of a useful thing to do too. So I'm going to place an image, and we'll grab the Adobe logo again. It's massive. This is a really messy file. Maybe I'll just create a new one to do the next thing. So you're talking using the image trace. I would create probably a black and white logo. I would expand it, and now I have this. You're talking about this. You have this shape, which is white, right? Oops. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, and then I clicked on the direct select tool, and it just would delete. I don't know what it said.
Yeah, here's what it looks like. You don't even need the direct select tool. I'm just using the regular selection tool. And that element right there, because there was white in the original, it uses every color when you trace it. It creates a shape for every color that existed. So that's why this exists. So this, yeah, you could just, in this case, you just simply remove it, delete it, and you got white space, you got white shapes in the middle of all these letters. You can do the same thing there. That's another way to do it. And again, I end up with sort of the same result. If I go to my layer 1 now, and I got a bunch of extra stuff in here, but oh, there it is. Those are my 3 objects, and you can kind of see if you know what to look for in each of these layers, you can see there are the three shapes that make up those three. Those three shapes make up that logo. Same as on this, not this one. Same as on this one. Three basic shapes there, and same as on this one. It's three different ways really to do the same thing is kind of what you're looking at here. So, all right, let's see. You wanted to talk about the gradient tool. Let's move all these in. Clear up some space over here. Keep right-clicking. All right, I'm just going to create a new artboard over here. That's the nice thing about Illustrator. If I run out of space, I can make more. There, new space. Put my Pathfinder over here. So, is there anything specific that you want to know about using gradients? Because here's the gradient tool. And the gradient tool is pretty powerful. It coordinates with the gradient palette. And what I can do is, by default, the gradient is set to black and white, which is, if you click it, this is what it does. You know, you can control basics. It's either linear or it's a circle. You can control direction or angle. So if I make it 90 degrees, it's going to change my direction. If I make it 45, it's kind of, that's sort of self-explanatory, hopefully. So Tristan, was there anything specific about gradients you thought might be useful to?
Could you show how they did like the 3D thing for the apple?
Oh, the gradient mesh?
Yeah, or that little too.
Yeah, we can play with that. If I can remember where it is. Alright, so we have this create gradient mesh. And this allows us to define how detailed this mesh is going to be. So rows and columns is, you saw on that Apple one, there were like 3 rows of lines and 3 columns, or maybe there was 4. That's sort of a rough gradient. You know, the more rows and columns you put in it, the finer your mesh is going to be. We can start with, start with a sort of a default and see what it looks like. So there's going to be our, and I always recommend turning preview on whenever you're working as much as possible where it's available, because you can see what it's going to look like. And maybe I don't really want to do that. I want to go to center, so that's just reversing it. Flat's just going to be like this, and now I adjust the mesh to make my gradient. So maybe we'll start with flat. Or maybe let's start with something that exists and then tweak it. So now I've got a gradient that's basically starting at the edges and going to the middle, and it's constrained by the shapes. And so I think I got the wrong tool. There. I get my direct select tool. Now I have the option to select pieces or parts or points, I guess, cross points on that gradient, and allows me to, you know, I can adjust handles to make the curves stronger or weaker. Say maybe I want to make this a little more rounded. I'll keep it a little simpler maybe. That might make more sense. Or let's go back. Maybe we'll start with something a little more basic. So we'll create a gradient mesh. We'll create a flat one and see what we can do from there.
What were you pressing to go back so fast?
Command Z. Yeah, and I think the gradient mesh might be easier to start with. Something like this. So that's kind of, I mean, there's maybe I want to make this. And I can kind of mess with the gradient to see what it does. This takes a little playing around with, honestly, to kind of get used to what's going on. You know, if I want my edge to be low. Yeah, it actually adjusts the whole shape as I'm messing with it. So now I have sort of warped my image using the gradient mesh. Let me see. Is that kind of, that's sort of a basic introduction to it. If I wanted to, let's try, Katie likes to do a cupcake, so we'll draw a cupcake real quick. Boom, boom, boom. Here's another cool thing Illustrator likes to give you all kinds of guides. So if I'm the same height as an element or another piece of my thing I'm working on, it kind of shows me all these little purple things that show up. So we'll create a, let's just fill this. Chocolate. And all I'm doing is clicking and dragging to make my curves.
What tool is that?
This is the pen tool. So all I'm doing is, you know, the pen tool is the one I use to create those basics rectangular shapes, which if you just click and click and click and click, that's what you get. If you, instead of just clicking and letting go, click and drag, it gives you the handle and the curve. So I'm clicking and dragging, and then what I'm doing, it continues that curve, or it wants to. So I want like a sharp corner there, so I can click back on that point that I just created, the anchor, and now I have a sharp corner. I have a new line basically, and I can click a new curve out from it. So I can do this. I can come across here, and I can, so we'll make it like blue frosting. Everybody does red, so I'm going to do something different. So maybe now what I want to do is I want to make this look a little more three-dimensional. So we'll start with the bottom, and we'll add a gradient. And I almost could do this with a straight-up gradient because this is sort of a circular, we're almost looking at a cylinder shape. So I can apply a gradient to it, and then from this gradient palette, and oftentimes you'll have to do, you know, pull some of these palettes off of your sidewall here to access them all simultaneously. Because what I can do with this gradient palette now is I can add color to it. It starts with just a basic black to white, but I can take my colors from my swatches and I can drop them into, and I don't have to drop them into existing colors. I can create new ones. So I can create a brown in the middle. I can maybe do another lighter brown on the side. So now I have this sort of gradient with a light brown in the middle. And I can adjust these. I can maybe give it a little bit of an angle. So it sort of looks like it's from that direction. You know, I can adjust where the center of my transition is. Make sort of a sharper edge on that gradient. Or softer edge on one side. So now you kind of see I have a little bit more of a three-dimensional look to this. So maybe I don't want to use the gradient mesh on this simply because it's not really that complex of a surface. I can remove, you know, if I have something in here I don't decide, well, I don't really want that in there. All I have to do is click on it, drag it off, and it just disappears. So I can add to it by dragging and dropping. See the little plus sign shows up. That's a really, I mean, that's a good that's your indicator that you're adding something to the gradient. Drag it off, and it just vanishes. I can add a gradient to the stroke if I wanted to. So I can outline something with a gradient. That's always kind of an interesting and scary thing to do. I don't normally recommend doing that, but you could. So we're just gonna do the gradient on the fill. And the other cool thing I could do is if I decided I was gonna use this multiple places, I could add it as a swatch. You can customize what's in your swatches. And the only downside to that is the swatches kind of stay with whatever file you're working on. So if I open a new file, it's going to have the default swatches, but I can add to it. I can drag this and drop it into my swatches palette, and then you see it shows up right here. So I can grab another element, say maybe this up here. I can click that swatch, and it adds that gradient to that element. It's exactly like what I created for this one. So there's some basics of gradients. So let's see if we can mess with maybe doing some gradient mesh.
How do you do that?
Do what?
The gradient mesh.
Oh, it's just an option under object. So I select my object, I create the gradient mesh, and it starts out with 100%. Maybe that was my issue with the last one. I was kind of messing with the highlight. It's trying to, and you can see my gradient's already kind of weird because it kind of bases the gradient mesh itself on the shape of my object. So it's trying to already look at the shape of my object and go, well, you kind of have an oddly shaped object. Maybe this is how it's supposed to look. But I don't want that much highlight necessarily, so we're going to make it like 50% highlight, so we don't have quite so much. Maybe 75, 60, somewhere in there. I don't really want to do to edge. I'll try to center. So then I have, and it's sort of there. Maybe what I want to do at this point is bring my highlight down. So I start dragging my mesh around a little bit. That's a little better. I don't know, this just takes some playing with to like get it looking like I want. And I can adjust the shape itself while I'm doing this too, which is kind of neat. So there, I've got a little bit better. It's kind of messy down on the bottom. You can also use the pen tool. That didn't work. Anyway. Alright, so I've kind of messed. So I've added a sort of a three-dimensional feel to that using that mesh gradient mesh. And I think you can add colors. Yeah. So I can add colors to that gradient. Let's see what else I can. So if I do that, maybe I want to change my frosting to. So it starts to add colors to the quadrants, and that might help it make more sense as to. So this quadrant, you can see that color moving around. So now I have a rainbow frosted cupcake. And this down here is these really thin quadrants or parts of my mesh. And so if I add color to them, yeah, they're going to start spreading. So this one, so it's kind of an ugly, ugly thing at this point. Maybe I'll go back to what I had. Now I've completely screwed it up. You kind of get the idea. All right. Well, we're at about 40 minutes. I didn't want to take much longer than 45 minutes in case anybody had to go somewhere else. Does anybody else have any questions or anything else you want to see me talk about, or any other? Has this raised any more questions for you guys? That's always the risk. No? Good, all right. Well, I think we're gonna try and do another. Was this helpful?
Yes.
Okay. Just want to make sure everybody's staring at me, going, "You suck." So I think we're gonna try to do one for Illustrator or for InDesign. Would that be useful too? I think overwhelmingly, I think the response to the survey was Illustrator, InDesign, Photoshop, sort of the basics and some interesting things you can do with them and what you can use them for. So we're gonna try and do some more of those. It might be me, it might be Adam or Katie. It depends on who's available, and they'll probably be at a different time just to kind of mix it up. And now I know not everybody who wanted to be here at this time today could be here because of other things. So, if you have any other questions and you have time to stick around and want to come up and talk with me a little bit about them, I'd be happy to I'll be here for a while yet this afternoon. So, that's all I got. Unless there's any other questions anyone has.
Is that how you created the apple that we started with?
I didn't create that, but yes, that is how it was created. It's a gradient mesh, and you can see I can mess with it. Like I can start adding colors to that mesh, and you can see that's kind of the same thing. But yeah, that's what it is. It's a very purposefully designed gradient mesh to make it look. Now I was just messing around with it, but I really had no goal like this. But that's the idea.